APIs. That includes like our own RPC services, our own relay services to make gasless transactions, our own automation services, so you can have like a fully automated chain as well as VRF, as most of game developers here will probably know, to add randomness to your chain. It is normally like quite difficult to get on your own network, as well as some powerful third-party services through our marketplace that includes indexers, block explorers, and anything else that you might need to basically build your own block space. So, some numbers about our ecosystem. So by now we already have like 50 different networks deployed. We did so far like this year about 300 million transactions overall. And roughly we're doing like 4.5 million transactions each day. That number is obviously constantly growing as we expand our network and projects that use our services. By now we're speaking about like roughly 500 different projects that already use us on like all sorts of different chains, either on their own chain or on public networks like Polygon or Ethereum. Some of these gaming projects include like obviously Arena-Z, but other partners as well, like for example GameSwift, who are also like part of the Superchain family, Psy, Anomaly, and other games. So we work closely together with both like projects that use OP or use Arbitrum. And that list is obviously constantly growing as we, and I myself personally, are like very excited about gaming itself. And as we'll see in a sec, gaming is actually like also the biggest vertical that is growing in Web3. Bit of a backstory of how we ended up here, because as some of you might remember, back in 2021 and 2022, actually like most games launched on like Polygon or Ethereum. And back then, like also talking about user experience, like when you wanted to play a game, it was very, very painful. Especially like during the last bull run, I don't know how many remember here, but when you wanted to play a game, like just minting an NFT was so expensive oftentimes that you needed like $100 just to start playing the game. And that was quite a barrier of entry. And just looking at the sort of roadmap of how the whole ecosystem evolved, we clearly see that there's a tendency to launch your own chain and own your own chain rather than deploying on a public network. And why is that? Like actually, just looking into like the progress we made over the last couple of years, it's clear that through like all the scalability that you can get by having your own chain, as well as like the benefits that you get from a UX perspective. I think UX is a big topic today overall. You can basically improve everything you do on your own chain. And what I mean by that is just like one big improvement you can make is by launching your own chain rather than just being on a public blockchain where you can't really impact, like if there's a public NFT mint, your transactions just take a second longer, for example. If you launch your own chain, you can actually co-locate some of the infrastructure that you use, which means you can decrease your latency significantly. And what I mean by that is if you co-locate like a sequencer, for example, with a bundler for gasless transactions, that would decrease your latency per transaction between like half a second to a second, which maybe for a DeFi project doesn't sound like a lot, but for gaming, that's like a lifetime. So those are like immense benefits compared to like being on a public blockchain. And that's why we also see this tendency. We see every game and every bigger ecosystem or gaming ecosystem moving into their own chain because it brings so many benefits. Yeah, looking into, I think, Arena-Z more directly, I think we already talked a bit on the first presentation from Han about the idea and the vision. I wanted to take a brief look of how it looks like actually from a chain and infrastructure perspective. So for any game that is here today, maybe they will already know like what's up. And one very important thing here to mention is by building on OP and the partnership with OP, Arena C will soon be able to access and be interoperable with other chains that are building on the superchain, which is very, very powerful, because just thinking about it, what will be soon possible is transactions from like all these chains that you see here on the right side will be able to get transmitted to Arena Z, which means you can have a mint on base and users on base minting an NFT, but actually it's an NFT on Arena Z, and without them ever needing to switch the chain, or seemingly they won't see it. And I think that's one very chain abstraction improvement that we can do, generally speaking, so that more users can go on chain and without less, or with less complexities overall. And then just taking a look briefly onto the infrastructure. As I mentioned, like part of Gelato is basically like all those native modules that we have. And through those, it's very easy to get like on-chain randomness, like verifiable randomness. If you want to do a pack opening, for example, and you want to make sure that the NFT that you get or the NFTs that you get are verifiably random, as well as like other things, like as soon as you need randomness, you can use it. We also have our own relay service that can be used for like gasless, which is pretty powerful because, as I mentioned, like this relay service is normally used to decrease the latency significantly, because what we do is co-locating infrastructure, and that just means like if your user base is here in Korea, you have your biggest user base in Seoul, we can optimize the infrastructure for it and save you another second in terms of latency compared to being on Polygon, for example. That is just not possible if you launch on a public blockchain, and that furthermore increases how easy it is to onboard users, because if they're used to like a Web 2 casual game, they won't wait 3 seconds for a transaction to confirm. And there are some other infrastructure parts here, but the most important ones are Relay, the VRF, and obviously like the bridge, so that users can also get from Polygon or other networks to your own chain, to make this pretty seamless. Just taking a look onto Web3 now overall, is we can see we are getting close to like 200 networks or chains being deployed, which just shows that like starting from 2023, there was really an explosion in terms of chains. Why is that? Because starting from 2023, it suddenly got widely available to like launch your chain without breaking a bank. Like it's basically part of like our cloud service as well, to make it like very seamless to launch your own chain, to own your chain, and just own your whole user journey. And that is, I think, one of the essential building blocks of a successful game. You need to basically own everything from like start to finish, so you can do play testing and know like where's like the breaking point. Do people wait too long for like a transaction, for example? And that's how you can, for example, improve it. And what we also see is that there are actually the majority of chains that are getting deployed are games. So I think there is a large wave of projects actually coming on chain and building their own chain. It just takes a bit of time to like actually get it out, but as soon as this is the case, like there will be a lot of games available, and that just shows that even though like in Web3 there's a lot of talk about DeFi as well, actually gaming is the largest sector, just looking onto the chains that are getting deployed, and that is also like a leading indicator for what we'll see in the next coming months. And just looking onto that growth, I think a couple of months ago there were a lot of conversations about when do we get to the 1,000 rollups. I think we'll soon be there, so it won't take too long. But maybe talking a little bit more about the also challenges that we still have in the space is, as you can see, the growth of chains was obviously very, very rapid within the last year. But if we take a look at the TPS growth, so the transactions per second on specifically those chains, we will see that we hit a plateau, at least for the last couple of months, and we had that a couple of months ago as well. Like, even though there's a lot of growth in terms of TPS, there's still a lot of like stale areas in terms of like growing chains actually. And how this is measured is just like TPS on average of all chains that are publicly deployed. And there's obviously ways to fix this, but the important thing here is the problem with TPS is not necessarily that there aren't enough chains. The problem is that there are different scaling approaches that are currently being taken. And so far, and we'll go into that in more detail in a sec, most chains do horizontal scaling, which goes a little bit into those sort of problems. Namely, we start with a lot of like fragmentation of chains, and that happens because we obviously deploy a lot of chains. We've seen there's already like 150 networks live. But this horizontal scaling, which just means there's L2s and L3s and ecosystems being developed, leads to fragmentation, which makes it like difficult to coordinate all those chains. And one thing we try to do at Gelato is basically solve these problems. And the first approach that we recently launched is basically a one-click marketplace, which allows you just by creating like sophisticated infrastructure and making that one-click deployable to basically spin up a chain in an instant. As well as then obviously coordinating all those chains. So if you're building an L2 like Arena-Z, you can basically build additional applications on top of it. And if those applications get big enough, they can also have their own chain on top of yours. That was like the one scaling approach. So scaling horizontally is right now the go-to approach for most projects in the space. And that will continue to improve through OP interop, which I mentioned initially, allows you to basically, within the superchain, deploy transactions or initiate transactions on one chain and then actually verify that transactions on another. So example would be you initiate a transaction on base, but the transaction actually gets settled on Arena-Z. That will soon be possible. OP interop goes on to testnet next month, with mainnet coming in Q1 next year. And through shared sequencing, you can actually create your own ecosystem. What I mean by that is, if you have your own ecosystem chain that you're currently developing and you want to have multiple chains within your own cluster, then through shared sequencing, you will be able to have like one state and one shared liquidity throughout all those chains, which is pretty powerful. So you can have multiple chains within your ecosystem and all those chains will talk to each other. But the second scaling approach that allows you to go even into a higher TPS range compared to like horizontal scaling is actually vertical scaling. And what you can do is that is feasible for like every project that wants to really have one very, very performant chain. And that is a different scaling approach to what has been done so far. And what I mean by that is you would completely be disconnected from Ethereum. And one design approach that we like to think of is you don't need to, as a game, you don't need to scale Ethereum. You should actually scale your application in your game. And you want to make that as performant as possible. And through using like different infrastructure compared to Ethereum, so not using like GAF as a client, for example, you could use different clients that allow you to get multiple thousands of TPS without necessarily needing to pay any rent to Ethereum. That also allows you to run like very optimized infrastructure, which means instead of you running infrastructure that is optimized for Ethereum, you would actually just run infrastructure that is optimized for vertical scaling. And last but not least, there have been a lot of conversations about bridges and how to bridge in and bridge out of chains so far. One way to use this and use vertical scaling as well is if you don't really rely on your Ethereum bridge, and that's actually the go-to today, like most projects actually don't use the canonical bridge to bridge in funds, but most projects actually use like a layer 0 or a wormhole or a socket to bridge funds into chains. Then this approach might actually be the one for you, because if you don't use the canonical bridge, there's actually not a lot of points why to be on Ethereum in the first place, because you actually pay Ethereum for being able to use that canonical bridge. So that is like one low-hanging fruit to like optimize chains even further. And just going back to TPS holding, like not growing significantly, is exactly because of that. Because right now every chain that deploys is basically a roll-up to Ethereum, or most of the chains are roll-ups to Ethereum. But in the future, that might look completely different. So in the future, there might be a lot of roll-ups that are actually not connected to Ethereum anymore, and that will be their own thing. And that is especially relevant for gaming, because as a game in the future, you might not even want to be connected to Ethereum anymore, but you rather want to just have your very fast performant blockchain where you can have millions of users on your chain, on your conditions. Yeah, and then last but not least, I think what one sort of ethos that I always like to talk about is, obviously we try to split up in two camps where we talk about Web 2 games and Web 3 games. My big thesis is that with all the work that is done here and the conversations that I made here, is that in the future we actually won't talk about Web 3 gaming anymore, because through optimizing the infrastructure, optimizing the applications and building more games, and abstracting away like all those user complexities, so not talk about wallets anymore, but rather talk about accounts, and talk about like more scalable applications. We will actually not talk about Web3 games anymore, we'll just talk about games, and that will be the go-to standard, because you can actually own your assets. Gamers are excited about that. I think they just got burned by NFTs, so we shouldn't talk about NFTs anymore. And by them owning the assets and having their account, it will be very similar to what they're used to, and that will allow us to just call these events gaming events rather than Web3 gaming. That's it. Thank you so much, guys. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.